Hi, everyone. Hope you're well tonight. I'm going to check in with you on Facebook, see how you're doing. Ah, hi, Lana. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Carmen. Hi, Sandy. Two waves tonight, huh? That's doing pretty good. Hi, Gary Hauk. BoJo, queuing this up to watch first thing in the morning the instant I turn on my computer. Okay, by the time you get to your computer in the morning, I'll be both here and on Facebook. Okay, as well. Sandy says hi. Okay, so I guess you're doing all right. I'm not going to wait any longer. I am just going to launch in. Please share for me and help me get as many people here as I can. Thank you. So the first thing I want to go over is actually a little bit, okay, of British politics. It's not going to take long, but it's going to be about a very important event, and that is the news about a new election in the UK. Johnson won his vote in Parliament for getting a new election. Johnson being Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, otherwise known as BoJo, as opposed to Bozo, I guess. I always thought, okay, it was as opposed to Bozo. And I'm just going to step through very quickly the Common Dreams article on this. With Brexit on the loan, Corbyn vows, quote, ambitious and radical campaign, unquote, as Labour backs the general election. Yes, Labour finally decided today to quit trying to back off the election, but to go in full steam. And Jeremy Corbyn made a public announcement to that effect, and Labour voted along with everybody else to approve the election. Now the date is not set yet as of the time. Okay, I looked at this. They're debating whether it's going to be on December 9th, 10th, okay, 11th, or possibly the 12th. The first date that was suggested by BoJo was the 12th, but there will be people saying why they prefer the 9th and the 10th and so on. And so I'm not sure what the various considerations are in terms of why people could want to have this on the 9th instead of the 12th, but I'm sure we're going to hear about that. Let me get the extraneous matter out of the way here. Just take a little bit of a look at a smile on Jeremy Corbyn's face. He does now seem to be summoning up the zest for fighting an election out, even though the polls know, or the polls show, I should say. I don't think the polls necessarily know, but the polls show that he's 16 points behind BoJo in the polling. that is Labour, is 16 points behind the Tories in the polling right now. So, but the idea of Jeremy Corbyn having an ambitious and radical campaign, if he means it, is an important idea, because not only Brexit is on the line in this particular election, but even though he's way behind, it's Corbyn's chance to take over the leadership of the country, and it's his chance to finally do the things that he's wanted to do for so long. And remember, Corbyn has at least some knowledge of MMT in his corner, and there's no doubt that he will use the knowledge that he and his advisors have, okay, if he's able to get into the leadership. And that's really so important, because the UK has been in a period of austerity for so long, with the Conservatives following the austerity program and simply squeezing the life out of the people, okay, of the UK. One reason why Brexit was popular enough to win a referendum was because the austerity seemed to be following the program that was set by the people in the EU. And the Tories seemed to share the program, in spite of the fact that they were not inside of the common currency zone yet. They still had the pound, and they still could use their sovereignty over the pound effectively to end austerity. But instead, they continued to pursue it and to follow, generally speaking, the kind of program that Trump has been following here. Corbyn called the election, quote, a once-in-a-generation chance to build a country for the many, not the few. Sound familiar? Sounds like Bernie here, right? And the Labour campaign group, Momentum, tweeted in response to the news that the election presented, quote, the opportunity of a lifetime to put an end to the shambolic mess the Tories have made and return hopes to millions. And Momentum said, let's do this. The decision to call a general election came after a protracted battle over the fate of Brexit, the process by which the UK would leave the EU, as determined by a referendum in 2016, where a bare majority of Britons approved departure. Labour has indicated that if elected to a government, it will hold a second referendum on the decision. The UK has real choices on the table, tweeted journalist Ash Sarkar. Quote from Ash Sarkar, okay, at IO Caesar. The fact is, the UK has real choices on the table. We can vote to address the climate crisis, build truly affordable housing, and democratize every sphere of society. Or we could vote for blue passports by Christmas and the inevitable Boris Johnson fellatio scandal by Easter. Yes, Boris Johnson has that kind of reputation. Of course, there's a donation drive that's going on at Common Dreams today, which is why you see that. Labour's backing of BoJo calls for of his call for a general election was preceded by Parliament forcing Johnson to ask for another extension for the Brexit talks with the EU, rather than looking to a no-deal Brexit, which could have catastrophic consequences for the British and the world economy on October 31st. The extension allows for a delay in the implementation of Article 50 in the EU treaty to allow the UK to leave the bloc. So in other words, they got a 3-month extension. Okay, Parliament had forced Johnson to seek that extension, and he got an extension through the end of January. He's trying to have an election in December. Hopes to win that election and then hammer out the final terms for a Brexit deal with a parliament which he hopes will be obedient to him. That's the issue here. Okay. And Corbyn said, quote, "I have consistently said that we are ready for an election and our support is subject to a no-deal Brexit being off the table," unquote, Corbyn said at the Labour headquarters Tuesday. Quote, "We have now heard from the EU that the extension of Article 50 to 31 January has been confirmed. So for the next 3 months, our condition of taking no deal off the table has now been met," unquote. In reaction to the announcement, the progressives and Labour backers called on voters in the UK to start organising and mobilising immediately. And here's a quote from Owen Jones, who said, "This is the fight of our lives. It's the fight for their lives too, by the way. The chance to end the lost decade of Tory rule and cuts, decline and chaos, and build a new society run in the interests of working people. Let's do this." If you want a second referendum within 6 months, vote Labour, tweeted writer Aaron Bastani. Actor and activist Rob Delaney, a U.S. expat who has lived in the UK for years, asked voters to consider, quote, "policies rather than personalities in determining who to vote for." He said Labour would properly fund the NHS. Tories would gift it to Donald Trump Jr., unquote. And quote again, Labour would spur a green industrial revolution. Tories would take orders from the world's worst polluters. The choice is stark. His Open Democracy economics editor, Laurie McFarlane, pointed out the election is about far more than Brexit. Electing Corbyn can prove a decisive moment for the climate crisis. And quote again, "This election would be the most consequential election in living memory," said Laurie McFarlane. Quote again, "Not because of Brexit. The real do-or-die issue is climate breakdown," unquote. I hope that Jeremy Corbyn can convey that to the electorate in the UK, that as important as Brexit is, and as important as getting a good deal on Brexit is, the real do-or-die issue is the climate breakdown. BoJo won't face that issue. Corbyn will face it and will overcome it by also achieving, in the doing of that, a just transition for the economy and the people, of the UK. So here's hoping that even though it looks bad now, that Corbyn can come from behind and catch up and win the election now in just a little more than a month, in roughly 6 weeks, and that he can be the Prime Minister, of England, with a secure majority. I shouldn't say England, but the UK, with a secure majority, with the votes he needs to make the changes he needs to make to keep the UK together and to have Brexit, to do both at the same time. Very difficult task. Moving on to U.S. politics and specifically to Bernie news. We have again from Common Dreams. Sanders says $3.8 billion in annual U.S. military aid to Israel should be leveraged to end the horrific treatment of the Palestinians. So Bernie spoke at the J Street National Conference at the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C. Yesterday. And it was hosted by the liberal-leaning Jewish organization J Street. J Street is an organization that has objected to the Netanyahu rule in Israel and to the policies of Israel but towards the Palestinians. They have done so for a long time, and they actually support what is probably the majority feeling within the Jewish community of the United States right now, which doesn't particularly care for the treatment which the Palestinians are getting, and which doesn't care for the Netanyahu the regime in Israel. Now, it may be that regime is coming to an end actually right now, but the replacement for Netanyahu promises to be just as bad on the Palestinian question. On what the future holds for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Senator Bernie Sanders expressed support for leveraging billions of dollars in annual U.S. military aid to stop Israel's horrific treatment and occupation of the Palestinian people. Quote, "My solution is to say to Israel, you get $3.8 billion every single year. If you want military aid, you're going to have to fundamentally change your relationship to the people of Gaza," said Sanders, who is vying to become the first Jewish president in U.S. history. In fact, Sanders added, I think it is fair to say that some of that $3.8 billion every year should go right now into humanitarian aid, by which he meant, of course, for the Palestinians. Aid for the Palestinians. The Vermont Center also took aim at Israeli Prime Minister by Benjamin Netanyahu, who he said is pursuing a racist and authoritarian agenda. Quote, "It is not anti-Semitism to say that the Netanyahu government has been racist," unquote, Sanders said to Applause. And then, quote again, "That's a fact," unquote. Quote, "We have a right to say to the Israeli government that the U.S. and our taxpayers believe in human rights and democracy. We will not accept authoritarianism or racism," said the senator. That's a small bit of news. It's a very important bit of news because it tells us where Bernie stands. And it tells us, it gives us an inkling anyway about what he would do as the president of the United States, what kind of policies he would follow as the president of the United States. So, before I go on, let me ask you to please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I want to spend most of the live stream now discussing the third link that I posted. And that link is to an article, is to an interview done by CNBC. John Harwood did the interview. I don't know if he's still with the New York Times as well. He was with the Times for years and years and years. He may be only with CNBC now, but he is extremely well respected in Washington, D.C. circles. But he was out, in Iowa. And he and Bernie had a sit down. They went into a coffee shop. And Bernie ordered a healthy green drink. And I'm not sure what John Harwood ordered. It may have been a lemonade. Looks like it might be a lemonade in that picture, if you can see it. Hopefully, you can't see it yet. Let me go back there. There it is, Bernie's green drink. And Harwood's about lemonade. I'm sorry that I'm blocking Bernie off right now. Maybe I should put myself somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure I can easily do that at this point. But anyway, it isn't critical. Not critical, actually, that I do that, because I'm not going to play anything. I'll let you go to the website and play things later, if you want to. There are a number of excerpts, from the interview that are there. But what I want to do is go over the transcript. So there's a little introduction to the transcript, of the interview. And that says, as the only self-described Democratic socialist in the United States Senate and Democratic presidential race, Bernie Sanders represents a unique figure in American life. 4 years ago, his message of dramatic change to remedy income inequality and other economic ills won a large following in his fight against Hillary Clinton for the nomination of a party he does not even formally embrace. The results encouraged him enough to try again for 2020, even at age 78. This race poses different and perhaps more formidable challenges. The political independent faces not only a moderate, conventional frontrunner and former VP Joe Biden, but also a powerful fellow liberal and Senator Warren, brandishing ideas nearly as ambitious as his. In debates and on the campaign trail, Warren has expanded her support this year. Polls suggest that Sanders has not. Well, perhaps the polls are just now beginning to suggest that he has expanded his support. He's taken over the lead in New Hampshire again from Joe Biden in a poll that was reported on only today. Biden has declined from 24% in New Hampshire to 15%. And Bernie has gained a few points and is now up to 22%. If I remember correctly, Senator Warren is up, at 20%, but Bernie is now in first place, in New Hampshire, and he has gained, of course, a considerable amount on Joe Biden, whose collapse may have started. That's the first indication that the collapse we've been thinking is likely to occur for Joe Biden now may be starting in New Hampshire. Okay, there's no indication that he's collapsing. In Iowa as yet, but completely apart from what the polls are suggesting now, I take issue with the description that Warren's ideas are nearly as ambitious, as Bernie's. If you read the platforms and you read the plans, they may appear to be nearly, as ambitious. But if you focus in on the Green New Deal, and you focus in on the housing plan, and you focus in on the various things he wants to do for labor, no, Warren's ideas are not nearly as ambitious as his. And you can't just restrict this to policy ideas. It's not just about the policy ideas. It's also about the ideas for building the movement, for movement politics, to drive the whole thing. Warren seems to have virtually no ideas about that. But Bernie talks about his theory of change. And that's one of the main things that he's going to talk about in the interview that we're about to go over. More on the background. Then on October 1, Bernie suffered a heart attack after surgeons inserted 2 stents to relieve coronary artery blockages. Sanders returned home to rest in Vermont as political observers wondered whether he could resume full-bore campaigning. He ended that speculation quickly. The gruff, rumpled candidate, who was memorably depicted by the comedian Larry David on NBC's Saturday Night Live, returned to engage his rivals in a televised debate 2 weeks later. Like many patients who undergo successful catheterization, and here Harwood is strictly accurate, I believe. It appears to have been very successful. Sanders says he has actually benefited from renewed energy. Moreover, campaign finance reports show that Sanders outraised all his rivals in the third quarter of the year and has more cash on hand than anyone else, by a fair margin as well. Over healthful green smoothies in a Des Moines coffee shop, I sat down with Sanders to discuss his health, his economic agenda, and his hope to become a 21st version of the president of his infancy, Franklin D. Roosevelt. What follows is a condensed, edited transcript, of our conversation. FDR, of course, was also the president, of my early childhood. John Harwood asks, one health question as we start. Has what you went through affected by you emotionally, how you think about life, or what's important? And Bernie says, as somebody who has had great endurance as a kid, I was a long-distance runner. Thank God I've been healthy as a horse. It was a little bit shocking to me when the doctor there told me, quote, hey, you're having a heart attack, unquote. I could not believe that was the case, said Bernie. And quote again, I don't want to be overly political in saying this, but my life is political. I went into the hospital and I worry about whether I could afford to pay. I have good insurance. And I'm sitting there and thinking somebody else here has that same discomfort, and they're sitting and thinking, quote, should I go into the hospital and end up with a large bill? Maybe it'll get better tomorrow. Perhaps I'll forget about it, unquote. Some of those people die or suffer permanent health damage. That's one of the things that I thought about, unquote. And there's a little excerpt there from the interview. If you want to go back and play this, just click on the link I gave you. Harwood said, you recently distinguished yourself from Senator Warren. She's a capitalist to her bones, and you're not. And Bernie says, that's how she has defined herself. Harwood says, is that just a marker, you being a little more progressive, or do you think that has real practical significance? And Bernie Sanders says, I think it does in a couple of ways. At this particular moment in history, where the average worker has not seen a real inflation accounted for a wage increase in 45 years, despite an explosion of technology and productivity, where you have a political system which is totally corrupt and owned by billionaires, where you have massive amounts of corporate corruption. I think the time is now. If we're going to save this country for a political revolution, it's not just more regulation. It's about involving millions of people, working people, young people, people who believe in justice, in the political process, to tell the corporate elite that enough is enough. We're going to change the system politically, economically. We're going to change the value system of this country. We're not going to worship corrupt billionaires anymore. We're going to respect teachers and child workers and cops and firefighters and small business people. That's what our campaign uniquely, I believe, is about. From your lips to God's ears, Bernie. John Harwood said, quote, you identify as a democratic socialist. You got the endorsement of Representative Ocasio-Cortez over the weekend. How far do you think you can take the United States of America toward democratic socialism? Question mark, unquote. And Bernie replies, it depends on what we mean by democratic socialism. What I am trying to do in many ways is pick up where Franklin Delano Roosevelt left off in a not widely publicized State of the Union speech he gave in 1944. This is what he said in so many words. We have political rights. You have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Well, that's great. But what we don't have are guaranteed economic rights, unquote. Bernie said, so you could vote, but you also have the privilege of sleeping out on the street. You can protest, but you also have the freedom to work 60 or 70 hours a week at starvation wages, as many Americans are now doing, by the way. Bernie goes on, you have the freedom not to have health insurance, not to be able to send your kids to college. What I'm trying to do in this campaign is to say that economic rights must be considered as human rights. What Bernie normally says is economic rights are human rights. Normally he doesn't say must be considered. He normally says are human rights. Harwood goes on. Do you also embrace the part of FDR that said adversaries hate me and I welcome their hatred? And Bernie says, absolutely. You can judge a person by the friends they have. You can judge a candidate for president by the enemies they have. There was a guy who was headed third way, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. He said, quote, Bernie Sanders is an existential threat to the Democratic Party, unquote. I agree with him. I am. I want to convert the Democratic Party. to break its dependency on big money and corporate interest and make it a party of working class people, of young people, of all people who believe in justice. It was a party much close to that at one time, under FDR, in the 30s, and through World War II, and even after to some degree. It was that party. So I say Bernie Sanders is not an existential threat to the Democratic Party. He is an existential threat to the corporatists and the centrists who have taken over the party, of FDR. He's an existential threat to them and to their presence inside of the Democratic Party. But he's not an existential threat to the historic identity of the Democratic Party. And if the Democratic Party still acted like it was FDR's party, Bernie Sanders would not be an independent. He would be a Democrat. But today, of course, that wasn't part of the interview. That was me. So John Harwood says, would it be your intention to appoint Democratic Socialists to big positions in your administration? Bernie Sanders says, well, you're going a little bit too crazy on the word here. I will appoint people who believe in the working class and the working families of this country, who are prepared to stand up to the incredibly powerful corporate interests that today dominate our economic and political life. I will appoint an attorney general who, for the first time in modern history, will go after the white-collar crime, which I believe is rampant. Instead of arresting kids, whether they are selling marijuana, maybe we go after some of the crooks on Wall Street or in some other major industries. I will appoint an attorney general who's prepared to enforce the antitrust laws that are on the books that have been neglected for so long. He might have said that have gone unenforced for so very long, because they have. So when I talk about democratic socialism, let's be clear. What does it mean? Question mark. Let's not get people overly nervous about it, unquote. And John Harwood then asked, the DSA website said, quote, we can't eliminate private corporations in the short term, so we have to confront them, unquote. Would it be your intention in the medium or long term not to have private corporations? And Bernie replied, quote, no, that's not my intention. What is my intention, though, is to make sure that workers have representation on those large corporations. We've presented the Corporate Accountability Act, not terribly radical. It exists in one form or another in other countries, including Germany. Instead of just being a cog in the machine, what about giving that worker some power and responsibility in terms of the shaping of that corporation? Should Wall Street and a handful of members of a board to determine whether a factory remains in the United States or whether it goes to China? Should a handful of wealthy board members determine whether or not there is a stock buyback, whether workers get decent wage increases and decent benefits? Question mark, unquote. John Harwood says, quote, you're not impressed by the statement that Jamie Dimon and the Business Roundtable put out saying that, quote, we're going to take considerations broader than just profit into our practices, unquote? You don't think they're serious, unquote? And Bernie says, quote, no, of course not, unquote. And John Harwood says, if you require that 45% of the board be workers, a required distribution of profits to workers, if you ban stock buybacks, Do you accept that would have a slowing effect on economic growth, unquote? Bernie Sanders says, it's not good enough just to look at economic growth. That has been the biblical statute that corporate America has been looking at. We have growth. We have growth. The average worker is no better off than he or she was 45 years ago. In the 30 years, the top 1% have seen a $21 trillion increase in their wealth. The bottom half of America has seen a decline in their wealth. Half the people today are living paycheck to paycheck. The question is our economy working for the people here? Is it working for ordinary Americans? Do people feel secure? Do they know that when they get sick, they can go to a doctor in a hospital? Do they know that their kids, everything being equal, can have a better standard of living? Question mark, unquote. John Harwood says, how do you factor in the fact that modern global capitalism has substantially reduced poverty in other parts of the world? And Bernie says, quote, when you talk about the global economy, you're right, thank God. The terrible, terrible poverty in the developing world, some of that is receding. That's great. On the other hand, you're looking at an unbelievable and grotesque level of global income and wealth inequality. You're seeing in country after country the incredible power of large multinational corporations and Wall Street in determining the future of those countries. You're also seeing in many countries, you're seeing a movement towards increased authoritarianism and away from human rights and democracy, unquote. John Harwood comes back. On Wall Street reform, you say you want to end, quote, too big to jail, unquote. You said the other day that Sherman Act violations by monopolists ought to have the potential for criminal indictments. I wonder if you think that principle also applies to cases like the Boeing CBO. He's been stripped of his position as board chairman. The head of the MAX airplane was fired. Is that the kind of case that criminal law is relevant to? And Bernie Sanders says, quote, this is the kind of discussion that we need as a nation, and that will take place when I'm a president. I'll give you 3 examples. In 2008, excuse me a second, Wall Street drove this country into the worst economic recession in modern history. Wall Street has paid tens and tens of billions of dollars in fines for their illegal activity. That wasn't a mistake. They were selling subprime subprime mortgages that they knew were worthless. And then Bernie asks, how many of these Wall Street executives went to jail? And John Harwood finally answered a return question, I don't think any. And Bernie Sanders said, no. That is why the American people are disgusted with what goes on in Washington, D.C. They see a kid selling marijuana get picked up by the cop. That kid will have a criminal record the rest of his life, and a Wall Street executive that causes a massive tragedy for our economy, no punishment. So, also another example, the pharmaceutical industry. They're not only greedy, they are corrupt. They are engaged in collusion and price fixing. Right now, as you know, state attorneys general are mounting a massive lawsuit against the opioid manufacturers. What they're saying is these guys knew exactly what they were doing. They were selling an addictive product all over this country, but many have died. How do you define that behavior? Question mark. I call it criminal. One more example. How do we describe the behavior of the fossil fuel industry? John Harwood replies, and you tell me. And Bernie says, quote, all right, I will tell you. They have known for a very long time, the executives of ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel industries knew that the product they were producing was causing climate change and, in fact, helping to destroy this planet. And John Harwood says, you put them in the same category as tobacco executives? And Bernie says, exactly. If you are producing a profit and you don't know that it's causing harm, that's forgivable. But if you are like the tobacco industry, we go before Congress. We swear that all of our research has shown that there's not a problem with tobacco causing cancer or heart disease. They lied. My father died because he smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Millions of people are in the same boat. These are liars. These are criminals. By the way, they're still selling their bloody products all over the world. Same thing with fossil fuel. We need as a nation to do something we've never done before and say to these corporate executives who have so much power, we're tired of your greed and we're tired of your corruption. I support and respect business people who produce new products, create jobs. God bless them. I do not respect or support criminals who are killing people, who are harming people, and are lying about what they are doing. John Harwood. Let me ask a question about real-world governance rather than campaign rhetoric. Joe Biden said earlier this year, nothing really fundamental has to change. You have proposed enormous changes. Would the practical results of a Biden administration really be that different from the practical results in a Sanders administration, given the fact that there are so many constraints on things getting done in Congress? And Bernie Sanders replies, quote, John, you're forgetting one very important thing. I am a different type of politician, and my administration will be unique in modern history, at least going back to FDR. You talk about the fact that nothing much really big ever happens, and there's truth to that. But what you're missing is that right now you have a Congress and a White House that are dominated by a corporate elite who have unbelievable amounts of money and influence over the political and economic life of this country. I'm not going to be dominated by those guys. I will take them on and I'll beat them. The way we beat them is with the understanding that real change has never taken place without millions of people standing up and demanding that change. That is the history of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the environmental movement. I will not only be commander-in-chief of the military, I will be organizer-in-chief. I will be organizing with a strong grassroots movement. We already have the nucleus. I'll be involving the labor unions, the African-American communities, the Latino community, the young people of this country, all people who believe in justice, working class people who are prepared to stand up and fight and take on the corporate elite. And when you do that, John, then you're not talking about incremental changes. John Harwood said, quote, but even if you get elected, even if it's successful to the point that Democrats win a small majority in the Senate, is Joe Manchin going to vote for your program? Is John Tester going to vote for your program? And Bernie says, quote, yeah, damn right they will. You know why? We're going to West Virginia. Your average politician sits around and he or she thinks, quote, let's see. If I do this, I'm going to have the big money interest putting 30-second ads against me, so I'd better not do it, unquote. But now they're going to have to think, quote, if I don't support an agenda that works for working people, I'm going to have President Sanders coming to my state and rallying working class people, unquote. And Bernie says, you know what? The 1% is very powerful. No denying that. The 99%, when they're organized and prepared to stand up and fight, they are far more powerful. John Harwood says, you've been running for president for 5 years. If there were a latent if there were a revolution waiting to happen, wouldn't we see more of it by now? And Bernie Sanders says, quote, let's talk about that. Think about the ideas that I introduced 4 years ago. 4 years ago, $15 an hour, it's minimum wage, quote, radical and crazy, unquote. 4 years ago, the idea of Medicare for all, healthcare as a human right, quote, Bernie, that's un-American, unquote. 71% of Democrats now support that. Climate change is a major threat. John Harwood. That's more people talking about it, not stuff having gotten through the process. Bernie Sanders says, how's it going to get through the process when Donald Trump is president? Who is beholden to his billionaire friends? And when Mitch McConnell runs the Senate? But the House of Representatives did pass a $15 an hour minimum wage. The House of Representatives did pass significant election reform, etc., etc. So it's waiting. The ideas that I am talking about are by and large supported by the American people. As president, I help bring our country together. I help bring our country together by talking about issues that Republicans agree on. They think that we should not have a trade policy that sends good-paying jobs to China and Mexico. I agree with that. We can bring people together around an agenda that works for families, not just the 1%. Boy, look how intently Bernie stares. John Harwood says, one of the constraints has been fiscal. Senator Warren is producing plans to pay for Medicare for all. You've identified revenue sources for about half of it. Do you think it's important to identify revenue sources for the other half? Or do you believe, as those who subscribe to modern monetary theory believe, that we've been a little bit too constrained by concerns about the deficit, unquote? So Bernie, without skipping a beat and without acknowledging the MMT in the question, replies by saying, quote, we're trying to pay for the damn thing. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, it is my view that the wealthiest people in this country, the top 0.1%, should be paying substantially more than they're paying right now. You have an insane situation. Let my Wall Street friends there tell me why it makes sense. So Bernie kind of dodged that question, a little bit, but he insisted, we're trying to pay for the damn thing. So is he telling us that he's going to tax sufficiently to pay for Medicare for all? Well, I certainly hope so. That may involve an increase in taxes, but it may not involve an increase in taxes. In previous live streams, I explain why. Governments at all levels are already spending $2.6 trillion every year on health care. That may be enough to handle healthcare expenditures for everyone in the country, which now are at $3.8 trillion as of 2019. With the middle people out of the way and the government dealing directly with the providers, as I said before, the possibility of $1.2 trillion or even more in savings from shifting to a Medicare for all bill, that possibility is there. So it may be a trivial matter for Bernie to pay, quote unquote. He knows it's not really paying for it, and we know it's not really paying for it. In fact, it's already been paid for. Enough wealth has been put out there to pay for it. Now the question is how to redirect that. How to redirect that in various ways through the government again, so that we can spend on health care while giving the illusion to people who don't understand MMT that we're actually paying for it. So I think I ended where Bernie said, let my Wall Street friends there tell me why it makes sense. But John Harwood says, quote, you have Wall Street friends? Question mark, unquote. And Bernie says, no, I don't. That was just a metaphor. I was trying to sound nice. And they both laughed. But please, defend for me Amazon, owned by the wealthiest guy in the country, making $11 billion profits last year and not paying a nickel in federal income taxes. I want to hear the defense, John. I don't hear it. There is no defense. And it's not just Amazon. It's dozens of these corporations, unquote. Okay. By the way, I found out from Bonnie today, who was reading, an article that indicated that the Bezos fortune, Jeff Bezos' fortune, is now down to $111 billion. He's still the wealthiest guy in the country, but he had to share 25% of his corporation with his now divorced spouse, who is now, I think, the sixth wealthiest person in the country or something like that. She's now standing very, very high up there. Now, he has lost a considerable amount of wealth, but he's still the wealthiest guy in the country because Bill Gates is at $106 billion now. So anyway, that's just a side comment on that. And so Howard continues, but you still have more revenue to go to make it fully paid for, yes? Question mark, unquote. Bernie says, the fight right now is to get the American people to understand that we're spending twice as much per capita, that of course we can pay for it. We're paying it now in a very reactionary, regressive way. I want to pay for it in a progressive way. You're asking me to come up with an exact, detailed plan of how every American, how much you're going to pay more in taxes, how much I'm going to pay. I don't think I have to do that right now. And John Harwood says, oh, you think it's foolish that Senator Warren is trying to? Bernie says, quote again, I'm not saying it's foolish. All that I'm saying is that we have laid out a variety of options that are progressive. We'll have that debate. At the end of the day, we will pay for every nickel of Medicare for all, and it will save the overwhelming majority of the American people who will no longer pay premiums. And John Harwood, quote unquote, John Harwood then asks, would you envision that at the end of a Sanders administration, the deficit would not be larger than it is now? And Sanders replies, quote, under Trump, what we have seen is a huge increase in the deficit. I think I will do a lot better than Trump. Now, that's a little vague. Does a lot better than Trump actually mean that Bernie will have a smaller deficit than Trump? I hope not, because what Bernie needs is to have a much larger deficit than Donald Trump, but one that is directed at the right people, and one that is fueled by government spending not accompanied by increases in the national debt. Why? Is there any harm to increasing the national debt? Well, there's a bit of harm because it usually benefits the wealthy and the well situated when the government issues debt instruments. But apart from that little bit of harm, there's a great deal more harm done by the political issue that's created by increasing the debt. What Bernie Sanders needs to have is overt congressional financing so that the deficit spending of the federal government is funded by overt congressional financing. In fact, so that all of the funding of the federal government is facilitated by overt congressional financing. What is that? It's when Congress mandates the Federal Reserve to place the amount that's necessary to spend appropriations made by Congress in the Treasury spending account. And when Congress further mandates that but the Fed place a further sufficient amount in the Treasury spending account so that all previous debts and interest that fall due within the period of an appropriation is also placed in the Treasury spending account at the start of any fiscal year. Anyway, going on with Bernie. Every major proposal we have brought forth, whether it's Medicare for all, dealing with climate change, transforming our energy system, making public colleges and universities tuition-free, and eliminating all student debt in America, that's all paid for, he says. And John Harwood then says, Congress has not been able to raise the gas tax by pennies to fix crumbling roads and bridges. You've got a wealth tax, which is enormous. Congress has not been able to pass card check unionization. You're proposing a huge increase in the clout of organized labor. How are those things even conceivable in 2019? And Bernie says, quote, okay, it's a good question. It's a fair question. But you're looking at status quo politics. I often use a statement that Nelson Mandela made. Quote, it always seems impossible until it is done, unquote. These ideas, quote, oh my God, it can't be done, unquote. Imagine everybody in America having health care. Duh. That's what exists in every country on earth. Why is that so impossible? Imagine the United States leading the world in transforming our energy system and saving the planet for our kids and grandchildren. Quote, oh my God, it's impossible, unquote. Really? What's the alternative? You're right in saying these are big ideas. I concede that. You're right in saying we have more or less a dysfunctional Congress. I agree with you. But where you're not right is understanding that if you and I were sitting here 25 years ago and I said to you, quote, you know, John, I think gay marriage will be legal in every state in this country, unquote. What would you have said to me? You would have said, quote, you're crazy, unquote. And John Harwood said, yes, I would have. Bernie Sanders then says, quote, I grew up at a time when African Americans could not vote, right? Kids could not go to a local school, could not drink at a water fountain, and change took place. Martin Luther King Jr., others, they stood up and they fought. 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote because, as we all know, women's place is in the house. 100 years ago, not a long time. Change can take place when you motivate people, when you get people organized, when they stand up for justice. That's what I believe. John Harwood then says, quote, if you've got a one shot in your first year, unquote. And Bernie interjects, wrong question. I know where you're going. You're going to ask me to prioritize. And John Harwood says, yes. And Bernie says, no. Once you get moving, you can move. I think that American people can chew bubble gum and walk at the same time. We must save the planet. That's not an option. We've got to combat climate change. We have to lead the world. I will demand that every American has health care as a human right. I will not allow hundreds of thousands of bright young kids not to be able to go to college because they lack the income, or 45 million people to be suffering from large student debt. And John Harwood then says, quote, but so you don't accept that you've got to pick one to start, unquote. Bernie Sanders says, quote, no, that's old thinking, unquote. John Harwood says, last question. When we did this interview 4 years ago, you ended it by saying, quote, don't underestimate me, unquote. Bernie Sanders says, quote, did I say that, John? And John Harwood says, you did. And Bernie Sanders, quote, and you underestimated me, unquote. And John Harwood said, I confess that I did. But right now, I think a whole lot of people are discounting your chances, or in your view, may be underestimating you. What would you say to them? Bernie Sanders says, quote, when I became mayor of the city of Burlington, way back, when in 1981 a local reporter said, quote, well, the odds of Sanders winning against the 5-term incumbent running as an independent are about 100 to 1, unquote. I won. Last time around, taking on the entire Democratic establishment. We ended up winning 22 states and got more young people's votes than Trump and Clinton combined. The ideas that I talked about 4 years ago seemed so radical and extreme. Today, they're kind of mainstream ideas. Right? Question mark. Don't underestimate me, unquote. And then there's a final disclosure. NBC and CNBC are divisions of NBC by Universal, as is, by the way, MS DNC. That's a division of NBC Universal as well. Okay. But Bernie got fairly good treatment here, I thought. And he had a really great chance to show how he thinks of things. And he was able to contrast, I think, actually very effectively, what he offers compared to what Senator Warren offers. And I think that what he's offering is a plan or a vision anyway for political change, and the policies that he advocates for are part of that particular vision. And the reason why they're part of the vision for change is because they envision change that people can get excited about. And that is so important. It's so important that people be excited. It's so important not only just to get them to the polls at first. It's so important to get them to keep the pressure on after Bernie wins. The whole point is to have the movement in back of you all the time. Remember, it said, look at the present Congress. It does hardly anything. It's devoted to the corporate interests. Look back to the Congresses of the 1930s. Yes, there were progressives in those Congresses who were swept in 1933. Actually 1932, and took over in 1933, and who were swept in again in 1936, and who continued to be very important in all the Congresses through the whole administration, of FDR. But there were also all those Southern Democrats, very, very conservative, very wedded to wealthy interests in their particular communities. And there were also very rich industrialists giving money to people in the Democratic Party back then, too. I mean, look at the Democratic Party in 1928 when Al Smith ran. It was a party without excitement. I mean, it was a party where we had people who were progressive warring with conservatives for the soul of the party. But then the party won extremely large majorities in 1933, and the external situation was an emergency situation. It was the Depression, and the country's economic survival was threatened. And from that point on, through the 30s, right through World War II, the United States was called to mobilize, not just by FDR, but by the external situation. We are entering a period like that now. We are entering a period where it will seem unpatriotic not to respond to the president who is leading us through the crisis, and whose platform is viewed by most people as essential to getting us through the crisis. When Joe Manchin comes up against that president who was unhappy with his opposition to major legislation, and he goes to his state to mobilize support in his state in order to get Joe Manchin to turn around, what do you think will happen? What happened during the 1930s and the 1940s when Franklin Roosevelt went to the states of various people and tried to get their support? Have you ever heard of the concept of coattails? These days, in this time, presidents don't have any coattails. I mean, people do not win because they're supporters of the president and the agenda of the president. And they don't think that if the president is opposed to them, that endangers their position in the Congress. Why do presidents no longer have any coattails? Because our modern presidents don't barnstorm the country to rouse people. I'm not talking about just in campaigns. I am talking about between campaigns, when policies have to be passed. Generally, presidents don't go around and barnstorm to get support from the masses of people for their policies. But Bernie is going to be not just the commander-in-chief, he's going to be the organizer-in-chief. And that organizer-in-chief is going to be going to state after state after state after state, calling for support for his policies. If the Democrats win a big victory in but 2020 and take over in 2021. And if Bernie Sanders is the president and he starts to barnstorm around the country for his program, and he's getting the support of the progressives all over the country who are with him, I think that what's going to happen is those centrist Democrats and even the rightist Democrats are going to fall into line, because there's another election coming up in 2022 when he takes over in 2021. And you can believe that if they've obstructed his program, he's going to be campaigning against them in 2022. Because that's the kind of guy that Bernie is. He's not going to sit still and take it. He's going to campaign against them. He's going to go to their states and he's going to campaign against them, whether they're in the Democratic Party or not. If they're in the Democratic Party and they don't act like Democrats, he'll see to it they're primaried. And he'll go to their states and support their primary opponent. You can count on it. I think you can take that to the bank. Using the old, the cliche. Okay, let's see what you have to say. Let me get up there. BoJo the Bozo. Sandy Degg says Bozo. Andy Blair has been here. Hope he's still here. And Steve Wolfbrand is here. And Cyril O'Reilly is here. And Steve says, hi, Joe. Did you see the latest NH poll? I talked about it. You probably picked that up, probably later. Jim Lockett says, Steve Pavana. So who is this gentleman speaking? And Steve says, I'm curious to what you taught in college. I'm thinking political science. I did teach political science, and within political science, I taught courses in international relations, in comparative politics, also in political theory, and also in methodology and political statistics, and as well in the philosophy of the scientific approach to political science. At one point, I even had a publication in Philosophy of Science journal. I think I'm one of a relatively few political scientists who ever had an article accepted in that particular journal. And Lana Dell said, that was a fantastic video. Thank you, Lana. I didn't know how people would take to my basically playing Bernie's role, you know. Rob says, hey, Yoda. And Lana says, oh, maybe she wasn't talking about this video. Maybe she was talking about, she's probably talking about the interview of John Harwood with Bernie. Yeah, that was a fantastic video, I agree. I'm sorry, I made a totally wrong assumption here. Okay, I'm trying to move this back and find the comments that I missed. Oh, my daughter Devora has joined. That's very nice. Where was I? Lots of comments. I love that. And Lana said, "Oops, I just saw your question. Yes, retired professor of political science. Not exactly retired. I left academia in the middle 1970s, came to Washington, D.C. I worked in policy analysis here. I also had a computer hardware company for a while during the 1980s. I worked a little bit in the market research and data warehousing areas but during the 90s. Then I moved into knowledge management and I did consulting and training in that field for 10 years. Then I turned again to my first love, which was politics, and started doing that once again in 2008. And since then, I've worked as a blogger and more recently as a live streamer. I've published hundreds of blog posts, and since 2008, ebooks as well. 7 of the 8 ebooks deal with MMT, applications of MMT. And Rob says Bernie isn't a democratic socialist, he's a social democrat. Well, he uses the label democratic socialist, and the way he talks about it, it's an extension, of FDR. And that's the real Bernie. And Rob says, Warren's policies make me say, that's cute. Try harder. Yeah. Steve said, yes, talk about the poll. And Jim says, no worries, Lana, we're all family. And Devora Firestone joined. And Steve said, Tulsi's in a 3-way tie for 5th place, and rising. Hope she continues to rise. Jim Lockett says, Bernie will shift left in the White House. It will be beautiful to watch. Yeah, I think so. He's already shifted left in this campaign. He's been much more left in this campaign than he was in 2016. His program is much more comprehensive now than it was back in 2016. What he's talking about is much more radical now than what he was talking about in 2016. Still not too radical, by the way. Only radical when you look at what everybody else is talking about. But yeah, he's been much further over to the left. Rob says Warren, and he says WAR, capitals in caps. EN Warren just copies the title, but when you dig in, it's neoliberal as you can get. Her GND, Green New Deal, is selling energy and technology in the market, or her student loan forgiveness, which is if you make less than the specified amount, then you'll get up to $50,000. But if you're married, you can't make more than the specified amount, and the debt given becomes less and less. Yeah, I know. It's all compromise. Why is there a compromise? Why is there a need for Warren to compromise? Why? Because Warren believes that she has to pay for stuff, that she has to tax in order to get these particular changes made. So anywhere she can save a little money, she's trying to save a little money. So when she campaigns for a Green New Deal, she talks about maybe $2 trillion or $3 trillion, whereas Bernie recognizes that it's going to be much larger than that. I don't think the $16.2 trillion is enough. I think it's going to turn out to be twice that amount. But the point is that Warren is nowhere near the ballpark on the Green New Deal. She's suggesting a joke A joke. Steve Wolfbrand says, many working folks live in their cars here in LA. Yeah, I know. I know that's quite true. In fact, there was an interview that Graham Elwood had today, or yesterday, it was on YouTube, where he interviewed someone who was living in his car who told his story. And that was what the interview was about. An articulate guy, a guy who had, a certain amount, of competence, driven out of proper places to live because there's no housing in parts of California. There's no available housing. In fact, when I think about it, I don't know how my daughter, when she got out there, was able to find housing that turned out to be acceptable to her. She's been there now for 3 years. And for more than 3 years, 3.5 years. And during that time, she has been able to stay in the place that she landed in. And it's been satisfactory for her. And it doesn't break the bank. It's probably about the same as a comparable place would have cost her here in the Washington, D.C. area. Jim Lockett says, whenever a right has a dollar cap on it, it only creates class tension. Stupid idea, Liz. That's true, but when you're talking about a right to education and the right to have a debt canceled, which should never have existed in the first place, there should be no cap on it. No cap at all. There's no reason for a cap anyway. No financial reason for a cap. Oh, Karen is in the middle of a blackout. Karen Reese is in the middle of a blackout. She doesn't have much left, in battery life. She wishes she could hang, but she's had a blackout for a couple of days. I presume maybe she lives in California, but I don't know. Sandy says, go Bernie. And Steve says, if they cheat Bernie again, it will be an existential threat to the Democratic Party. Yeah, I agree. It will be an existential threat. In fact, it will be in Bernie's power to kill the Democratic Party right then and there by running as an independent. And of course, he'll get all kinds, of criticism that, he broke his word and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. But he can say they broke theirs, that their word was to have a fair primary, and they broke their word first. I think that's what he's got to say. And if they say, we never gave him our word that he would have a fair primary, we never made any such promise, and then that will be the death of the Democratic Party right then and there. Jim says, I'm looking into moving into a minivan with a gym membership. $800 bedroom rentals suck. Yeah, that's certainly true, Jim. Well, I'm trying to see more of your comments, but my computer is not cooperating so that I can scroll down. I'm sure it will free up in just a second, and I'll be able to see more of what you've had to say, but let me see. what we can do. Oh, there we go. Steve says, me too. And Jim says, living the dream, brother. And Rob says, I don't think Bernie made an effective case to distinguish himself from Warren. He should have actually presented the problem in his policy prescriptions to solve them and demonstrate why she fails to meet demands that necessary in fulfilling the public purpose. I don't think Bernie had the freedom to do that. In other words, he was asked certain questions by Harwood, and he had to answer those questions and answer them in a relatively brief time so they could actually get on. But apart from that, that would have gotten him into long discussions of how his policy prescriptions are different and are better. And then there would have been all kinds of ways of answering that, and difficulties, of that kind. There's time to make the policy case at a later time. The really big difference between he and Warren, and I think in the long run, the most important difference, is the theory of change. It's the theory of change. Rob says, this I'm a capitalist argument only appeals to a much smaller demographic. People still haven't gotten over the dumb socialist word. Over most people just don't understand these labels, but they do understand policy IF, and if they are explained clearly, concisely, cogently, and most importantly, if you yourself believe in these policies because you have a record of fighting for these policies. I think that's true, but you have to get the questions that lead you into discussing the policies. And he wasn't really directly asked what's the difference between himself and Warren. He might have twisted one of the questions that way. But I think it was more important to emphasize what he would do in relation to the movement. I really think that is the huge, huge difference. That's what makes him totally unique in this race. I mean, Warren, as we go forward, can come out with more plans and more ideas to more closely approach what Bernie has to say. But what she cannot do and will not do is to talk about a theory of change that is like his. She will not talk about actually mobilizing and organizing the population and keeping them mobilized and organized so as to have the president become an effective leader of the Congress in the way that FDR was an effective leader of the Congress. I mean, the things that have to be done this time. You are going this time, you're going to have to pack the court or use Article 3, Section 2. I tell you, you'll never get the stuff through the court if you don't destroy the power of the 5 conservative justices to interfere with your legislations. Unless you can do that, you're going to be frustrated, you're not going to get things done, and the people are going to vote you out. You have to make sure they cannot interfere. That means you have to pack the court or you have to use Article 3, Section 2. It's one or the other. Okay. And to use those, you need the movement behind you. And you need to be saying to people, look, I need this. They can't oppose this legislation because it's too important. It's the key to the environmental crisis. It's the key to Medicare for all. We cannot have them disqualifying this on some technicality. That's it. And then he'll get the cooperation of Congress. If he goes at them strong and hard and with a campaign from state to state. And Steve asks, have you seen the YouTube channel, The Young Woman Who Lives in a Van with Her Snake? No, I didn't. And Jim says that isn't a Bob cheap RV living, laugh out loud. And Steve says, the Lebanese revolution succeeded today. Oh, I didn't realize it had. Oh, yes, it did succeed, right, because the prime minister or the president stepped down, right? So it has succeeded in that sense. But I don't know whether it will really succeed in solving their problems. That remains to be seen. So Randy Hedgebeth has joined, and Steve Wolfbrand says Iceland jailed corrupt bankers. They did. Wasn't that wonderful? Iceland was wonderful. Rob says, hey, Yoda. Hey, Bonnie, can you pour me another round? No, I'm just kidding. If you were here, we would pour you another round, Rob. Joanne Olenhouse Ricadio has joined. And my wife Bonnie rejoined. And Elizabeth Bergen Netherland has joined. Steve Wolfbrandt has joined. No, I mean, he commented. Take the money from billionaires and the bloated military. Kathy Langan has joined. Hi, Kathy. Matt Waldy has joined. And Steve Wolfbrandt says, don't underestimate us. Karen Reese has joined. Dale Weaver joined. Karen joined just in time to tell me that she doesn't have much in battery life. She wishes she could hang out, but there's been a blackout since Saturday. And Karen says, okay, live draws, big power. Take care and see you when things get better in California. Okay, Karen, thanks for coming. Thanks for telling us. Susan Eldridge has joined. And Susan says, Bernie is leading in New Hampshire. Yeah, we covered that, Susan. Isn't it wonderful? Sandy Deck says, do we really expect the DNC is going to be fair? If they are, it will be a miracle. Well, I think Bernie ought to make it known that he insists on a scrupulously fair primary election in every single state. And he ought to say, I have promised that I'm going to support the nominee of the Democratic Party, whoever it is, and I'm very serious about that particular promise. But I've been assuming that these primary elections are going to be scrupulously fair all across the country this time, and that the DNC is not going to rig these primaries. That's the assumption, that's the condition under which I make my guarantee. And I'm letting that be known now. I don't really expect him to say that. Because they have this little rule inside of the DNC. Okay, and basically the rule gives the DNC the right to disqualify anyone who's running in the primaries as not in keeping with the principles of the Democratic Party. And so, basically disqualifying that person even if they've won. Steve Wolfbrand said FDR had fireside chats. He did. And Bernie will probably come back to those. If you recall, Jimmy Carter had something like fireside chats as well. But Jimmy's fireside chats were not as effective as FDR's fireside chats. Because, especially in these days, it takes more than fireside chats. It takes more than social media. It's going to take those campaigns. It's going to take going to see people. It's going to take the permanent campaign to keep them absolutely mobilized. Absolutely mobilized. Okay, folks, we're sort of down to the end of the comments, and I've been on for some time. So it's last call for comments or questions or thumbs up. Okay, or anything else you've got. I'm going to remind you again to please share, like, and subscribe. And go to my Patreon page. Please, please, please start to go to my Patreon page. Remember, even $1 helps. It really helps me to keep the lights on. Even though I don't entirely keep them on. I turn most of them off so you can see me better. I try to get rid of the glare. However, I do need to keep the lights on the rest of the time. So please, 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 I'm basically doing this full time now. I've got 5 streams a week, and each one is from an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I prepare for them. In other words, the job of selecting these articles, not simply the commentary on them, but just simply the job of deciding what to cover, what is most important, why it is most important, making these choices, boiling down the 30 different things I go through every read in order to decide what should we cover tonight. That in itself is a full-time job when added to the stream time and the preparation time. Okay? So I'm easily putting in 40 hours a week on this. So I need your help. Please, please start to help. There are a few of you who are helping and who have been helping for a very, very long time. And thank you, thank you, thank you. All of you. That has really been a help. But, of course, I need to have this much more broadly distributed. So thank you very much for any help that you can give in that particular direction. And remember, sharing, liking, and subscribing is also help and also very important. So Kathy Langan has just said, please support Joe's work, and thank you very much for that, Kathy. Anyway, good night to all, and I'll be seeing you tomorrow night. I'll be back tomorrow night at roughly 9 o'clock with more. Oh, no, wait. I won't see you tomorrow night because I have to go to something that I have to go see my granddaughter perform. So I won't be able to do it tomorrow night, but I'll be live streaming on Thursday, and I'll be live streaming on Friday this week as well, and live streaming, of course, on Saturday as well. So that's my schedule for this week. So tomorrow, I won't be able to be here because I have a command performance to go see my granddaughter perform, which is going to be great fun for me and for Bonnie as well. So, okay, I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for coming, okay, and for being here. Good night.